So hi everyone, thank you very much for being here today. My name is Simone and I'm community manager with the OED team. And I'm delighted to be here today with my colleague Jessie Fry. So now I'm going to hand it over to you, Jessie, and I'm going to disappear from the view. So um, here you go. When you're ready, you can start.
Thanks so much, Simone. I appreciate it. Hi everyone. Just want to say thank you very much for inviting me here to talk to you about the OED. Just as a brief introduction, again, my name is Jessie, and I'm an editor on the New Words team on the OED. That's part of the Oxford Languages Department, which is part of Oxford University Press. And so my main responsibility is to research and draft new words and new meanings, or we call them new senses, into the OED as well as our other dictionaries. So today, I'm just going to keep it really brief, I think. I'm going to aim for about 20 minutes. And I thought we could start with me sharing my screen, and I'll show you the OED website, and we'll go over a couple entries and the basic components of an OED entry. And after that, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the historical thesaurus of the OED, so what that is and how researchers make use of it. Beyond that, I'll talk to you a bit about the rationale behind adding a new word or a new sense to the OED, which is a topic that's very close to my heart. Being on the New Words team, that's something we're constantly talking about, is just how do you decide which words go into the OED. Yes, and at the end, I will just give you a brief summary of what our World English program is and what we're hoping to achieve with that. Okay, so this is the OED.com website. There are a lot of different parts to the website, and there are a ton of resources that explain the history of the OED and how to navigate entries. But for our purposes today, I'll just be talking about using this main search bar. And you can use this main search bar to search either the OED itself, the dictionary, or the historical thesaurus. So for now, we'll just start with a basic entry. And this is the entry that we always use for presentations like this. And that entry is cat. So I'll search for cat. So it's taking us to a bunch of different results. The one we want is at the top here for the animal, but you'll see that really what the website is doing is it's searching for the string of letters CAT. So it's also showing us that it's asking if we might be interested in this nautical verb or maybe this initialism. So there are done a bunch of different entries that are called cat in the OED, but this is the one we want at the top. So this is the entry for the word cat. And there's a ton of different components and sections to each entry in the OED, as you can see. They're organized helpfully in these tabs at the top. But before we even get into the tabs, I wanted to draw your attention to this little section at the top here. It says first published 1889, not yet revised. And I'll click on the details just to show you. So I think this is an extremely important aspect of each OED entry to know about. I think a lot of OED readers may not know about it, but it's essentially illustrating that the OED itself is it's a changing and living thing. It's a dynamic text, and its entries are in different states of revision and modernness. So that just means that there are a ton of entries in the OED that were first published many years ago. In this case, this entry was first published in 1889. And we're in a constant process of trying to fully modernize existing entries in the OED and bring them up to date. But because the OED is so huge and there are so many entries, that makes it really hard. So we'll never be able to completely update the OED simultaneously at any given moment in time. So I think this is useful for readers to know about, because if you see an entry like this, it was first published in 1889 and it's not yet been formally revised. You can expect to see possibly some kind of antiquated language and some definitions. At times you may find a complete inaccuracy. You may notice that the latest quotations in these entries aren't later than the mid 20th century, for example. Whereas other entries like computer click on the publication history here, we can see that computer was added first in 1891, but it was fully modernized in 2008. And just because it hasn't been fully modernized does not mean that modifications haven't occurred. We do add new meanings to these entries on an ad hoc basis. Maybe we'll add a pronunciation or a quotation. So little tweaks may have been made, but overall, entries like cat have not yet been fully modernized. So going back to the tabs, when we open up the entry, we're taken right away to the meaning and use tab. And that's just showing us, actually, I'll go over to computer for this. That's showing us all the different senses or meanings that this word has had over time. They're ordered chronologically. And within each sense, you can see the quotation paragraph. I'll just expand that view here. So the quotation paragraph is a list of quotations that show how the word in that meaning was used throughout its history in English. And these quotations are also ordered chronologically. So in this case, 1613 was the earliest use that editor was able to establish for the word computer in the sense a person who makes calculations. And then that editor went on to add further quotations illustrating how computer was used in that sense throughout time. In long entries with many senses, it's nice to use this view on the side to kind of orient yourself. It's a little overview. Other tabs include fact sheet, which is an overview of the different components of the entry. The etymology, this is a section I think that really interests a lot of OED readers. So by etymology, we kind of mean just the story of how that word came to be in English. So is it a borrowing from another language, perhaps? Or is it a combination of existing English words? And there is usually a lot of information in the etymologies, so you can spend quite a lot of time reading these. I find them quite complicated. I'm not very good at etymology at all. I have a hard time understanding it, to be honest. But thankfully, our etymology team very helpfully provides the summary at the top, so we can see that basically what your average person would need to know is that cat is simply a word inherited from Germanic. Computer, on the other hand, is formed within English by derivation. It's from compute verb plus the suffix er. Okay, meaning and use tab we covered. Pronunciations tab has the IPA plus audio files. The frequency tab will show us how frequent that word occurs in English relative to other English words. And then the compounds and derived words tab will show us just that. So compounds, including the word computer, like electronic computer. You can click on these and it'll take you to the OED entry. And derived words like computerized, which are words that are based on the word computer. So that's a really quick and dirty view of an OED entry and its basic components. The next stop for us is the thesaurus. So I'm going to take us back to the homepage. There are a couple ways to access the thesaurus and to start exploring it. One way is to use this main search bar here and just toggle down to historical thesaurus. But I wanted to show you first a kind of top-down view of the thesaurus. And to access that, we just scroll to the bottom here and click historical thesaurus. So this gives us a really useful, succinct description of what the thesaurus is. It groups senses and words into categories, and it orders them by date of first use. And so it's essentially a taxonomic index of language history. But it's not just for looking up synonyms. You can also use it to explore the different words that are used for a particular concept or meaning over time. And then it's showing us here the three main categories into which most words in the OED are categorized. So the world, the mind, and society. And beneath those umbrella categories, you can see there are a ton of subcategories. And within those subcategories are, I think, thousands and thousands of additional subcategories. And within those, you can find the OED entries themselves. So one way people will explore the historical thesaurus of the OED is to start from this top-down view and just kind of click through subcategories and see what comes up. So food, nouns. So these are words for food throughout history. Another way to use the thesaurus is, like I said, using the search bar. So um, in this way, we can look for a particular word in the thesaurus and see how it's been categorized, and also see what other words have been used throughout English history to describe that same concept. So one word I was looking at recently was restaurant. And if I search for that, um, there are a bunch of different results, but I'm really just looking for the main sense of restaurant and eating establishment. So this result, it gives us this kind of handy view of all the subcategories in which this word has been nested. Ultimately, it's within the world. And if I click on View in Historical Thesaurus, it'll take me to that category itself, where restaurant exists. And it'll show me all the other words that have similarly been categorized within that subcategory. And they're ordered chronologically. So other words for restaurant throughout time include eating house, feasting house, settling house, slap bang shop. Restaurant is there in the early 19th century, grubbery. Yeah, so I think a lot of people research language this way. I recently learned that it's apparently a popular pastime among researchers of the historical thesaurus to look up words that refer to being drunk. And the reason for that is because that concept has been an especially productive concept in English. It just means that there have been tons and tons of colloquialisms in English to refer to being drunk over time. And, every generation has its own set of like slang words that refer to that. So if we look up the word drunk, we can kind of see what these researchers are finding. Yes, I think this one, that has drunk intoxicating liquor. So the earliest word in this category is drunken, but you can see that people were using the word inebriate, overseen, overflown, podicle, rosined. I just think this is fascinating. Pickled. This category is huge. So yeah, so if you're curious about the thesaurus, that's one way to kind of explore. You can click through categories, you can search for specific words. Right, next topic was the rationale behind adding new words and senses to the OED. So the main principle we're intending to achieve is to only include words that show sufficiently sustained and widespread usage. That's not true in every case, but it's true in most cases. And what we mean by that is just, has this word developed enough of a foothold in English that it is worth including in the OED? And that's a particularly important consideration for the OED because, as you may know, once a word or meaning goes into the OED, it's never taken out. So we want to be absolutely sure. So just to describe our workflow really quickly, before we even decide whether we're going to add a word to the OED, we are looking at our database of new word and meaning suggestions. So that's this huge database we have where we just collect suggestions that aren't in the OED yet. And these come from personal observation by editors. They come from other dictionaries, volunteer programs. We have computer programs that will gather millions of quotations across the internet, and that program can then tell us, hey, this word is cropping up a lot on Twitter and it's not in your dictionary. Maybe you should think about adding it. So they come from all over the place. And then once they're in there, we can assess them over time to see if any pass what we call our inclusion policy. And essentially, the format for that, using that policy, is that we have different parameters for giving a word suggestion points. So a suggestion would get points if it has a ton of hits on a certain database, for example, if it's used in an OED definition, but we don't define it in the OED, usually it'll get points for that. We want to define words that we are using in definitions. There are a ton of different parameters that we use, and then we see how many points the suggestion got, and we use that to determine if it should be added or not. And then we research and draft the word at that point. And when we're drafting an entry, some sources of evidence, what we're trying to do is not only define the word based on the evidence that we're seeing, but we're also trying to find the first documented use of that word or that meaning. And when we do that, we use evidence sources like Google Books. We'll use other dictionaries, song lyrics, Twitter, JSTOR, ProQuest, Nexus. Yeah, we have a ton of avenues available to us online. So yeah, that's a brief overview of adding new words and senses to the OED. And the final part of my presentation was to give you a summary of our World English program. So the context for that is that traditionally, American and British English have kind of been upheld as the standard Englishes, like the correct Englishes. Sometimes they're the only Englishes. But English, as we know, is a language that's spoken all over the world, and it's spoken by a huge variety of people who come from a huge variety of communities and cultures and backgrounds, and that naturally has a bearing on how they use English, on the words that they use to describe certain concepts, on pronunciations. And so our goal with our World English program is to very much move away from the idea that there's only American and British English, and to represent traditionally underrepresented varieties of English. So an example of one of these varieties of English could be Singapore English. There's Welsh English. We're working on Jamaican English, West African English. There are a ton. And what we want to do is treat these in a balanced and proportionate way alongside British and American English. And we're also working hard to add region-specific pronunciation so that you're not just getting American and British audio files for every word in the OED, you're also getting pronunciations from all over the world. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope I stuck to 20 minutes. And yeah, maybe we can just jump into questions, whatever you think, Simone.
Thanks, Jessie. That was a lovely tour of the OED. Thank you very much. I always learn something new. But yeah, we've got some questions. The first question we've got there is this one. What is a new word you draft recently?
It's a good question. Yeah, I always have a hard time kind of remembering what I've drafted. But recently I've been working on some interesting things, and they've been all over the map. So I drafted split end, like the thing on your hair. And I think in that same week I was working on non-monogamous. So wildly different concepts. No bueno. So like saying, oh, this weather is no bueno. And also to give someone a break. So I was surprised that wasn't in the OED because that seems like such an old phrase. But yeah, so a bunch of different things.
Oh, can I ask something about no bueno? So when you're doing the entry for that, obviously it's in Spanish, but when you're writing the entry, are you saying it's because it's a way it gets mixed in? People say, oh no, like English speakers say no bueno. So I'm curious how you distinguish that usage, that it's kind of, again, I don't even know how I would, this is why you do this and I don't do it. Like how did you go about starting that?
Yeah, so I think your question is, how do you decide if the word is Spanish or English, like when it's moved into English? Is that right?
Yeah, just like the context. How is this not just like that? This is specific in that it needs to be its own entry rather than this is just this phrase translated in to Spanish, right? It's like a distinct phrase that people are in English are using.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so how did you start that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the reason for adding it was because it's very familiar to Americans. I think in English contexts, people say, you know, like the weather is no bueno, so it doesn't have to be in a Spanish sentence. And so it is Spanish, but yeah, we're like treating it as English because it's found in English contexts. But it essentially, I think it sometimes has exactly the same meaning as it does in Spanish, but I learned that it's not grammatical in the predicative use in Spanish. So you wouldn't directly translate the weather is no bueno into Spanish because no bueno isn't used predicatively in that way, if that makes sense. So there are some distinctions in English, but yeah, it is essentially Spanish, two Spanish words.
And Jessie, am I correct in assuming that it also has to do with the amount of evidence that you find of usage of that phrase in English?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, if you know, to inform the decision of whether this is something that has actually been borrowed into English and it's not some occasional usage.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. So I think if you go on Twitter and you search for is no bueno, you'll find a ton of instances of people using no bueno in English sentences. So that to us indicates that this has made its way into English.
Right.
Does that answer your question, Paige?
Yeah, yeah. It's just that's the ways in which other phrases from different languages, I think, is just really interesting, and how they get up again, because it's all kind of like this hybrid, again, a living thing of language. I wonder. Before we move on to a different question, I think it might be helpful for students, because I think most of our students here, probably for a lot of their lives, and we have a lot of people where they speak multiple languages. We have a lot of Spanish speakers and whatnot. But I think for a lot of us growing up, if you didn't know something, you heard, oh, go look at the dictionary, whereas like the dictionary was the prescriber of language, and the dictionary tells you what's right and wrong. Is that kind of how you guys understood the dictionary? And I think most people that work with dictionaries like to think of the dictionary as it describes, right? It's not dictating how to use language. It's describing how people use language. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that, because again, I think that's going to be very different from what our students are used to hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. It was different from what I was used to hearing growing up. If a word wasn't in the dictionary, it was kind of like you weren't allowed to use it because it's not in English. Um, but yeah, we very much view ourselves as a descriptive dictionary, like you say. I think there are many different ways in which we try to uphold that principle. The main way is, and really the core principle underpinning our lexicography, like our act of compiling dictionaries, is that when we are working to research a word and to add it to the dictionary, the order of operations for us is looking at tons of evidence first before writing the definition. So even if I have an idea of what I think the word means or what I think it should mean, I'm trying very hard to cast that aside and to just look at how people are using the word. And then my definition then is based on the patterns I'm establishing in the vast amounts of evidence that I'm looking at. And as a result, I'm describing that the ideal goal is that I end up describing how people are using it without passing judgment or without saying this is right or wrong. But I can see why people nowadays, even still understand, the dictionary to be saying like, if we include this, the OED has a very rigorous kind of inclusion policy. So if we're not including a word, then the word isn't in English yet, but that's not necessarily true. We just may not know about it. We may be waiting to see if more evidence comes up. Maybe it's only in spoken English, and that's naturally harder for us to establish. So yeah, but overall, yes, we are very much a descriptive dictionary.
Thank you. And just like you said at the beginning of the hour, language is a living thing. It's always evolving and changing. This is why you use different slang words than your parents do, and why it's hard for you to read Shakespeare or anything written by anybody from the 1600s or 1700s, because language has moved on. It's not preserved in stone. It's always changing.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So as a good follow-up to this discussion, I think I'm going to jump on to not to the next question in the sequence, but to this one here that I think kind of relates to what you've been talking about. So what does standardized English even mean anyway?
It's a great question. I think there are a lot of different definitions for what it means to be standardized language. But I think usually what people mean is that it's a highly regulated variety version of English that's been subject to a set of predetermined rules about what's correct. And it's naturally associated with things like prestige and power. And, people who speak standardized English traditionally are viewed as people with more value than others. So, that's an idea that we're trying to get away from, in our dictionary, is like only including what's traditionally been considered standard English, or even, if we don't include standard English, not saying this is non-standard English, we want to move away from that idea. We're just presenting words how they are used, and we're saying who's using them, in what contexts, and what do they mean, without using language that's now often viewed as highly judgmental, like standardized or non-standard.
Thanks, Jessie. And there is this question here that I think also complements this discussion for why is it important to document the history and usage of words.
Yeah, I think this question also has a lot of different answers depending on whom you ask. For me, the answers kind of get very philosophical very quickly. But I think it's really important to document and to study language usage because it helps us understand ourselves, and it helps us understand how we make meaning of the world we see around us, and why. It can be used for good purposes and bad. And I think you really see that when you're studying language. You can see how it helps us to be seen and heard and better understood by others. It can help us to better see, hear, and understand each other. But it can also be used to divide and to perpetuate power structures. So I think it's an extraordinary meditation on the self. And I think that's Toni Morrison who said that. I don't remember, but I think that's what it is. It's an exploration of who we are. And I think it's also, documenting language use really does help validate what English is. And so even if, at the same time, we're trying not to say this English is good or this English is bad, there is a truth that if, we are documenting world English varieties, for example, we are lending them more credence, and we're amplifying voices that traditionally have not been amplified, have not been heard. And I think that's really important, really significant. And yeah.
Thanks. That was
go on for a while about that, but I'll try to keep it
that
brief.
was a lovely answer. Is that part of the reason why you got interested in language? Because we've got this question here.
I think the way I got, if I think back to how I got interested in language, I think about when I was young, driving around with my parents, I was really interested in reading billboards, and for whatever reason. And I remember thinking about, at some point it occurred to me that the language of billboard advertising was really interesting, because often the language that's used in billboards is multidimensional. It has different meanings. There are puns involved. And that showed me that language is a multidimensional thing. It has layers, and it can be used to achieve different ends in different contexts. So yeah, it didn't start as a very philosophical entrance into why I love language, but I think just realizing how language can be used to mean different things, but also reading. I mean, it's hard, I think, to enjoy reading and not also be interested in language.
Can I ask a processy question about
Sure.
Jessie's work? Jessie, so this is going to be very fresh and new to all of our students, and thinking about how a word evolves over time, and how we've talked all quarter about the way how language has power and how language shapes us and shapes our ideas, before we even know the words. The language again shapes us. And I'm curious, when you are tasked with a new word, similar to what our students are going to be doing, they're going to have to find primary sources, instances of the word in use. And I'm curious, what's your go-to, or what are some places that you look for those primary sources of the word in use? You mentioned Twitter earlier, and y'all can always use Twitter, but what are some other places you look?
Oh, that's a great question. It really depends on the word in question. So like when I am researching a new word, I'm trying to decide, okay, this word is used like in finance, or it's in baseball, or it's slang. So that'll kind of dictate where I go to find quotations, because you're probably not going to find like a crazy slang word for being drunk in a finance dictionary, for example. So I'll often look on, I think usually I go to Google Books first, or actually Google Books has been kind of crappy lately. So I'm going to archive.org quite a bit. It's great. And I look through song lyrics. There's a great website that was actually built by a previous editor of the OED called The Right Rhymes. So it's a hip hop dictionary, also historical dictionary. So showing how like words in hip hop have been used over time. And I go to like JSTOR. I'm looking at like academic journals quite a bit, magazines, newspapers, Newspaper Archive, newspapers.com, ProQuest. There's a ton.
Yeah. Archives are good.
Yes.
This actually relates to this question here. What do you do if you're supposed to draft a new word, but you've never heard of it before?
Ooh, that is a good question.
That happens a lot. So I think you just start with general research online, and try to establish as much as you can what it means. Some words are obviously harder than others. We've been using ChatGPT more, actually. So,
don't tell my students that.
It is often very, very incorrect what it's saying. But I find it can, it'll sometimes like point me in a useful direction I wouldn't have thought of. So we're trying to use that a bit more and like figure out how to use it like most efficiently. We have a ton of Oxford reference materials that are useful, but also we have this huge group of external consultants. So these are people who are experts in their field, and they're on call essentially with us, and we can send them questions and they'll lend their opinion and their expertise to the topic at hand. So I find that extremely useful to be able to talk to someone in person who knows what they're talking about.
So you probably do what a lot of our students would do and just do like a Google search.
Like very much so. Yes. Yeah. Nothing fancy there.
And then kind of try to cast a wide net and then see what's popping up and then go narrower.
Yes. Yeah. So it is easy to find, like everyone has an opinion about something online nowadays, right? So it's easy to find like someone saying, oh, this definitely means this, it only means this, and it doesn't mean that. But you really have to kind of, even if they put it really succinctly and convincingly, you really have to fight the urge to just like copy what they say. You really have to explore a ton of different sources and see like maybe there is some aspect of this that's contentious or disagreed on, and like you have to try to get as full a picture as you possibly can within a reasonable amount of time. So it's a tricky balance at times.
You said Twitter. Do you use Reddit a lot?
We are not able to cite Reddit in quotation paragraphs at the moment, or maybe we are just starting to. And the reason for that is because I think it is difficult to establish that the date is true. So for quotation paragraphs, we are not citing Reddit as much as we are Twitter, but you can use Reddit. We use Reddit for research purposes. Yes.
Actually, there are a couple of questions that relate to this process. So I'll put them both up and then I can put them back if you want to address them separately. But there is this one. Is there a way for one to infer when a word is extremely old? Like, is there something about a word that you immediately look at and go, yep, that's an old word right there? And the other question is this one. how do you know if the first usage you
Ooh,
found is actually
good
the
job,
first
y'all.
time that word has ever been used?
Good job.
Yes. Yeah. So can we put that first question back on the screen
Yeah.
about old words? That's a really good question. Yeah, I think it's hard to explain. I'm sure you guys know what that's like. You see a word and it sounds kind of familiar, but something about it looks a little bit antiquated or off. So I think that might be a way that, like, when I'm given a word to draft, if I haven't really heard of it before, I might think, okay, this seems it sounds kind of archaic. So in that case, I might go on a resource like EBO, early English books online, or like a database that has Middle English, or we have Middle English dictionary. So just, yeah, like looking for databases that have older documents and searching for the word there. But the only real way to establish that a word is old is to find, try to find the first documented usage of it and see when that was published. And the other question was, how do you know if the first? Yeah. So the answer is you don't. And you really just kind of exhaust all your research options. And really, I mean, the reality is, and this might be something that readers often don't know either. I'm not sure. But, we say we have our quotation paragraph and their quotations are ordered chronologically. And the first one is supposed to be the first use of the word in English. It's really just the first documented use we were able to find and whose date we were able to verify. So, very, very, very frequently, the reality is that English or any language, words spring up in conversation, or nowadays, I think online. They're not necessarily going to first be literally used in a published, written down, documented way. So 99.9% of the time, I think, the first usage that we're providing in our quotation paragraph is not literally going to be the first time that word was ever used in English.
Yeah. Like, and to piggyback on that, I'm sure maybe you guys have heard this. I know when I teach Shakespeare, we talk about it a lot. When all these phrases are attributed to Shakespeare, like, oh, he coined this word, and it's like, well, in some cases maybe he did, but in most of them, it's probably something that people were saying out loud,
Yeah.
and the play is probably the first time it was documented. And again, maybe sometimes it was his own cleverness, but a lot of times it's probably an instance in which people were probably using it, but there was no documentation of it. So again, and we're never really going to know, but we know that this is the first, instance that was documented.
Yeah, I'd never thought of that. That's a great point. Yeah, I think you're right.
Right. So next question we've got here is this one. When it comes to the OED, does it dive deeper into definitions as they change over time, or is it just the most current one?
Right. So you'll have to let me know if I'm maybe not understanding the question right. But I think, yeah, the way I would answer this is just to say that our goal is to show how the word changes over time. So we're not just showing the most current meaning, we're showing chronologically the oldest meaning that we can establish in documented English, and then illustrating the life cycle of the word as time goes on. We're looking at a ton of evidence after that point and seeing, okay, is this evidence just in that initial first meaning, or is it kind of starting to deviate into another meaning, or is it a completely different meaning? So you can see, if you're looking, especially at a long entry like cat, and there are a ton of entries that are much longer than cat in the OED, but if you're looking at an entry like that with a bunch of different meanings, you can kind of trace how you have that first meaning, and very often later meanings kind of are similar to it, but are not quite the same. And then eventually in current English, maybe the most current, modern, widely understood meaning of that word is just vastly different from the first use. So yeah, that's our goal, is to show all of those meanings to the point that, we can again establish that they have widespread usage and are sufficiently sustained in English.
So like a word like cool, right? You can like that. Y'all can look up cool, and you can see where it starts, and then it starts meaning something regarding temperature, and then mid 20th century when it starts getting applied to certain groups of people to mean something. And cool actually has a really cool cultural history. But then it takes on new life in different decades. But all of you have access to see how it's been used since it was first documented. So you don't lose all those previous instances.
Yes.
Or something like, and I'm sure that this is, and I actually disagree about this when this would change for y'all, but many an English professor grappled against the rise of the word literally, right? That's right. Which for if you guys can say, I'm sure I know you all use it because I hear you say it literally. Like the word literally actually means like in actuality, like actually means like by the letter. And so when you say that I'm sweating to death, or I'm freezing my butt off, or whatever, you are not literally freezing your butt off, or you would have no butt, right? Like that's, you can't mean it. But now it's been used as a word that just means extremely, right? Like it's vague. And I'm wondering, has that, I haven't looked it up recently, has that changed in the OED?
I think that was always the goal, at least in theory, that we would be documenting just people are using literally to mean not literally
died laughing.
But yes, yeah. So I think that's always been the goal, is to just show like, okay, people are using it this way, and there are many people who view this as incorrect, but that's how people understand it, and that's how they're using it, and you can very defensively add it to the OED because of that. So
I remember when I was in grad school and all the new usages, and again, I try. You have to as a literature professor, you have to go back and forth because on the one hand, like there's some kind of standard and whatnot, but on the other hand, I very much think language is a living thing. But I've also been a copy editor, and so it's like, what do you do? And so there's always going to be those English professors who are like, they're using this wrong, and it's like you gotta have a little bit of both, right? Like, okay, this is how we're using this usually, but being receptive to the way things are changing.
Yes,
it's very hard.
It is. I agree.
When I looked at that question, maybe I misunderstood the question, but when I looked at it, I thought about the historical aspect of the OED, because the person was asking about whether only the current sense is looked at. So could you elaborate a bit more on the revision process, Jessie? Because I know words get revised in the OED, but you can still look at an entry and see the evolution of meaning through time. So things are not actually removed, although the senses do get revised. So I thought that question was perhaps asking about that. I might be wrong, but that's what came to my mind when I saw the question.
Okay. Yeah, right. So I think I alluded to this early on in the presentation, but basically, there are some entries that, like cat, that were published a long time ago, and they may have had a new slang sense added to them at some point over time on an ad hoc individual basis, but that entry hasn't been fully and formally what we call revised or fully modernized. So this like modernization process involves a different team from mine, but they look at these existing entries in the OED, and they assess things like, are there any new meanings that we haven't added yet? Has this word been used since 1911? The latest quotation in this quotation paragraph is from 1911, but I heard my neighbor use it yesterday, so I know I need to add a later quotation to this quotation paragraph to show it is used in the 21st century as well. They're changing some of the language in older OED definitions to make them more understandable to a modern day audience. I'm sure there are many other considerations they're making when they're modernizing these entries. Those are the main ones.
Thank you. Well, we've got this one now, which I think is a very good question. So I'm noticing that more and more words are added to the dictionary periodically. Since new words from different types of English, like American English and British English and Jamaican English, could one argue that dictionary is becoming more inclusive?
Yeah, I think you could definitely argue that, especially when you consider the World English program that I was talking about earlier. I think that is one way of describing our goal there, is to be more inclusive, to literally include more voices in the OED. And that's not just about including vocabulary from other varieties of English than British and Americans, like Jamaican English. It's not just about including Jamaican English words or pronunciations. It's also about how editors decide which quotations to add to the OED, especially because the OED is viewed as such an authoritative text. We have to be really mindful of our voice, the voice that we use in the dictionary, and the decisions that we're making as editors. And so what we're trying to do more and more is to include quotations from sources that are not just like The Guardian or the New York Times, or from, Western texts or American and British sources. So even for words that are not necessarily Jamaican English, maybe that's a word that's just broadly used in English all over the world, we would want to include a Jamaican person saying that word in the quotation paragraph as well. And that's another way that we're trying to be inclusive.
Good question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. And now we've got this one. What's one of the one more interesting entries that you've worked on?
Right. That's a great question. Yes, there are different types of interesting, as you know. I think recently I was working on kind of a fun, interesting one, which was Jello salad. So I thought that one was going to be easy, and it was so hard. But it was also really interesting. It's interesting to kind of explore what Jello salad has entailed over time. So, like, it used to be
gross.
It used to be, yeah. It's arguably still. I mean, I think it's a very polarizing food. I did learn that in the mid 20th century, it used to be kind of savory a lot of the time, like with mayonnaise and celery and meat. And nowadays, I think it's often associated with like the Midwestern kind of cuisine, and like it will sometimes include cookies and cake and stuff, and it's like served as a side dish, and it's not really a salad. So that's another interesting thing about the word Jello salad, is why is it called a salad? It's not what we nowadays would probably describe as a salad, but that's still what people call it. So
and then historically, like salad just meant like a mix of something. So that's why you have like potato salad, which isn't associated with greens, but I think most of my students here think salad. They think, oh, lettuce and cucumbers and tomatoes and maybe a protein, right? But historically, I think it just meant like a mix of stuff.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I was reading that at the time, I guess this is like post World War II, like the world, this might be a bit of a stretch, but like post World War II, the world is in chaos, and we just need everything to be neat again, including our food, and specifically our salads. So we don't want all the pieces of the salad getting all over the table. We want to encase them very neatly and understandably in Jello.
A Jello mold. Ew.
Yeah. So yeah, there are a lot of really interesting kinds of insights into the American psyche, I guess. You could write a whole dissertation on Jello salad.
You said it was hard to research.
It was so hard. Yes. Yeah, it was so hard to know what people meant, like what they were referring to. So you're reading a newspaper and someone's like, this is a recipe for Jello salad, or I had some Jello salad the other day, but you don't know what ingredients were involved unless you have a picture. So it's hard to like establish what's going on in those older quotations and the older evidence for foods. Yeah, that's difficult for food in general when we're trying to define food words.
Interesting. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
That was a cool story.
I think this especially is going to be something new for our students with the OED and having access to the OED through their, college library, and thinking about what, and y'all pay attention right now. Why is the OED, or how is like the OED different from when they just go to dictionary.com or merriam-webster's.com? I think, because I know for a lot of my students, like they don't having to go to the databases and the access, like that differentiation is not clear to them yet. So
Yeah.
how is the OED different from any old dictionary website?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. There are a lot of different ways. Main one, and I'm biased saying this, but I thought this before I started working for the OED, but it is better. It is authoritative for a reason. It's much, much larger than other dictionaries you find online. It's much more comprehensive. It's historical. So you're seeing words that were in use in the past but may no longer be. So showing the full trajectory of a word throughout English history. You're seeing quotations that help to prove that word's trajectory through English. So it's arguably the most robust treatment of World English varieties. So varieties other than UK and US. I think we probably have the largest editorial staff. So a huge amount of expertise there. Most quotations. So, but I think the main difference with those dictionaries you mentioned is that the fact that we are a historical dictionary. So we're not just showing current English words, we're showing like the full spread of history.
Yeah. I was fascinated too, because sometimes I get like a newsletter email from like dictionary.com, and they said, these are our new words. And I noticed in the most recent one, they said, oh, we just added girl dinner. You guys don't know what girl dinner is from TikTok, but it's like, why are they, and again, I can appreciate that that's a term people are using, but I can imagine that won't be in use in 5 years, and they probably will take it out. So I was just very confused by what that meant, that they're including it, because I feel like it's a much different process than what the OED does, where it has to get some kind of traction. So it's not going to be something that's irrelevant in, again, 5 or 10 years.
That's a great point. That's one that I missed. Yeah, we have a rigorous inclusion policy for sure. So I think after this, I'm going to make sure that girl dinner is in our database of suggestions, like I said, but I'm not sure if someone were to assess it tomorrow that it would necessarily pass inclusion. But it should be in there, because you never know. Maybe in 5 years we will all still be talking about girl dinner.
Maybe.
Yeah, because I just wanted to say a big thank you to you, Jessie. That was a great presentation, great answers to the questions. Thanks everyone who submitted questions. I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you, Paige, for inviting us. So thanks again. It was great. I really enjoyed it. I hope everybody else enjoyed it as well.
Thank you so much, Simone and Jessie. Let's give them a big round. Yeah, they're clapping for you. Yay!
Thank you.
Okay, great. So have a very good rest of your days there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.